The morning mist hung low over Nashville's outskirts as Robert "Bobby" Mitchell pushed through the glass door of Mel's Diner, the familiar bell chiming his arrival. At 72, Bobby carried himself with the remnants of military posture, though his shoulders bore the weight of decades since Vietnam. His weathered hands, scarred from shrapnel that doctors never fully removed, gripped a worn leather wallet containing exactly $14.37. The diner buzzed with the usual morning crowd: construction workers grabbing quick breakfasts before job sites, office employees rushing through their routines, and a few retirees who treated Mel's like their personal social club. Bobby had been coming here for 3 years, ever since Martha passed, finding comfort in the predictable chaos of clinking dishes and morning conversations. Sarah Chen, the young waitress who'd been working mornings for 6 months, barely glanced up as Bobby settled into his usual corner booth. The red vinyl was cracked and patched with electrical tape, but it gave him a clear view of the door and kept his back to the wall. Old habits from a war that never really ended in his mind. "Coffee black," Bobby said when Sarah finally approached, her attention already drifting to a table of businessmen signaling for their check. "Uh-huh," she mumbled, pouring lukewarm coffee without making eye contact. "You eating today?" Bobby studied the laminated menu he'd memorized months ago. The breakfast special cost $8.99, leaving him enough for coffee and a small tip. "Just toast, please. Wheat, if you have it." Sarah scribbled something illegible and hurried away, leaving Bobby to sip his coffee and watch the world move around him. At the counter, Frank Morrison, a regular in his 50s who owned a local auto shop, was holding court with his usual complaints about taxes and traffic. "These old-timers don't know when to quit," Frank was saying, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Taking up space, moving slow, expecting handouts. My grandfather knew when his time was up." Several customers chuckled, and Bobby felt the familiar tightness in his chest. He'd heard variations of this sentiment before. Not just here, but at the grocery store, the post office, anywhere people felt comfortable voicing their impatience with anyone over 60. The irony wasn't lost on him that Frank's grandfather had probably never dodged bullets in a rice paddy or watched friends die for a country that seemed increasingly eager to forget them. Sarah returned with 2 pieces of barely toasted bread on a plate that had seen better days. She set it down with a slight thud, and Bobby noticed she'd forgotten the butter he'd asked for. He started to mention it, but she was already walking away, her ponytail swishing with the urgency of someone who had more important things to do. Bobby ate his dry toast slowly, making it last. Through the window, he watched Nashville wake up. Delivery trucks rumbling down the street, early commuters already looking stressed, life moving at a pace that seemed to have no room for reflection or gratitude. He remembered Martha teasing him about being an old soul, even when they were young, how she'd catch him watching sunsets or stopping to pet stray dogs while everyone else rushed past. Martha would have liked this place, he said quietly to himself, a daily ritual that brought both comfort and pain. At a nearby table, the Morrison boy, Frank's son Jake, who looked to be in his early 30s, was showing his father something on his phone. "Dad, look at this video of that protest downtown. These veterans acting all entitled, wanting more benefits. Like, we get it. You served. But that was 50 years ago." Bobby's hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup. 50 years ago. As if time somehow diminished the weight of what they'd carried, what they'd lost, what they'd given up, so others could sit in warm diners and complain about their taxes. Frank nodded approvingly at his son. "Exactly. My business taxes are through the roof, and they want more money for people who should be taking care of themselves by now." The words hit Bobby like shrapnel, sharp and unexpected. He'd worked construction for 30 years after Vietnam, his body slowly breaking down from both war wounds and honest labor. When arthritis and nerve damage finally forced him to retire, his savings had been modest but adequate until Martha's cancer treatments. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Now, living in a one-bedroom apartment on Social Security and a small VA disability payment, Bobby wasn't looking for handouts. He was simply trying to survive with dignity in a country that seemed to have forgotten the promise it made to those who serve. Sarah reappeared with the coffee pot, topping off cups at every table except Bobby's. When she reached the Morrison table, she lingered, laughing at something Jake said, her whole demeanor transformed from the indifference she'd shown Bobby. "Excuse me," Bobby called softly, raising his empty cup. Sarah glanced over, her smile fading. "What? Could I get a refill, please?" She sighed audibly and walked over, splashing coffee into his cup with obvious irritation. Some of it spilled onto the saucer, but she didn't seem to notice or care. "Thanks," Bobby said, meaning it genuinely. Sarah was already walking away. Bobby stared at the coffee ring stains on the table, each one representing a morning he'd spent here trying to feel connected to something, anything. The loneliness had been the hardest part of losing Martha. Not just missing her presence, but losing the one person who truly saw him, who remembered the young soldier who'd come home from war, confused and angry, who'd worked every day to become a man worthy of her love. The bell above the door chimed again, and Bobby looked up to see a tall man in a baseball cap and worn jeans entering. Something about the way he carried himself reminded Bobby of his own father. Confident but not arrogant, aware of his surroundings but comfortable in his own skin. The man paused in the doorway, scanning the diner with the same careful assessment Bobby had learned in Vietnam. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Bobby saw something unexpected in the stranger's gaze. Recognition, not of who Bobby was, but of what he represented. It was the look of someone who understood that every old man in a corner booth had stories to tell. Battles fought, love lost, and found. The stranger chose a table across the diner, removing his cap to reveal graying hair and a face Bobby thought he might have seen before, though he couldn't place where. Sarah appeared at the man's table almost instantly, her demeanor completely different, attentive, smiling, eager to please. "Good morning. I'm Sarah. I'll be taking care of you today. Coffee to start?" "That'd be great, thank you," the man replied, his voice carrying a slight Oklahoma drawl. "And could you make sure that gentleman over there gets a fresh cup, too? His looks pretty cold." Sarah glanced toward Bobby's table, confusion flickering across her face. "Oh, sure. Do you know him?" "I know enough," the stranger said simply. Bobby felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with coffee. When was the last time someone had simply noticed him? Seen him as more than an inconvenience or a relic taking up space? He tried to catch the stranger's eye to mouth a "thank you," but the man was already deep in conversation with Sarah about the menu. Frank Morrison's voice cut through the diner's ambient noise. "I'm telling you, Jake, it's like they think the world owes them something. I've got nothing against veterans, but that was a long time ago. Time to move on." Bobby saw the stranger's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The man's hands, Bobby noticed, bore their own scars, the kind that came from hard work and perhaps harder times. There was something in the set of his shoulders that reminded Bobby of the soldiers he'd served with, men who'd learned to carry burdens quietly but never forgot what they'd seen. Sarah brought fresh coffee to Bobby's table, though her smile seemed forced and she still didn't make eye contact. "From the gentleman over there," she said, nodding toward the stranger. "Please tell him I said thank you," Bobby replied, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. But Sarah was already walking away, and Bobby wondered if his message would be delivered or simply forgotten in the rush of morning service. He sipped the fresh coffee, actually hot this time, and felt something shift inside him. Not hope, exactly, but a reminder that kindness still existed, even in small gestures between strangers. The stranger caught Bobby's eye and raised his coffee cup in a slight salute. Bobby returned the gesture, two men acknowledging each other across a crowded diner, their shared understanding needing no words. Outside, Nashville continued its relentless pace. But inside Mel's diner, time seemed to slow just enough for human connection to take root. Bobby didn't know yet that this moment would change everything, that the stranger across the room was about to make a choice that would ripple through their lives and the lives of everyone watching. He only knew that for the first time in months, he didn't feel completely invisible. Garth Brooks had learned long ago to read a room before making himself known. 30 years in the music business had taught him that people reacted differently when they knew who he was. And sometimes, those reactions got in the way of genuine human moments. This morning, sitting in Mel's diner with his baseball cap pulled low, he was simply another customer enjoying breakfast and observing the small dramas of daily life. But watching the elderly veteran in the corner booth being treated with casual indifference was stirring something in Garth that went deeper than celebrity concern. His father, Troil Raymond Brooks, had served in the Navy, and Garth had grown up with stories of sacrifice and service that shaped his understanding of what it meant to be truly patriotic. Not just flag-waving and anthem-singing, but actually caring for those who'd given the most for their country. The man in the corner, Garth could tell he was military by the way he sat, the way his eyes tracked movement, the careful economy of his gestures reminded him of his grandfather, Colleen Brooks, who'd served in World War II and carried those lessons of discipline and honor until the day he died. "Sir?" Sarah was standing beside his table, pen poised over her order pad. "Ready to order?" Garth looked up, noting how different her tone was when addressing him compared to the veteran. "I'll take the full breakfast. Eggs over easy, bacon crispy, wheat toast." "And Sarah?" He glanced at her name tag. "That gentleman over there, he's been sitting with an empty coffee cup for a while. Mind making sure he gets whatever he wants and put it on my tab?" Sarah followed his gaze to Bobby's table. "Oh, him. He just orders toast, usually. Doesn't talk much." "Maybe he doesn't talk much because nobody's really listening," Garth said gently. "Why don't you go ask him what he'd like? Really ask him and let him know it's taken care of." Something in Garth's tone made Sarah pause. She studied his face more carefully, and he saw the moment recognition began to dawn. But before she could say anything, Frank Morrison's voice boomed across the diner again. "I'm serious, Jake. These old veterans, they're living in the past. Vietnam was what, 50 years ago? My generation's been carrying them ever since." Garth felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard this sentiment before, usually from people who'd never worn a uniform, never faced the choice between their own safety and their duty to others. He thought about the veterans he'd met over the years, at concerts, charity events, VA hospitals, men and women carrying invisible wounds that never quite healed, struggling with a civilian world that often seemed alien after what they'd experienced. Sarah was still standing beside his table, clearly wrestling with whether to acknowledge who she thought he was. Garth made the decision for her. "Sarah, I need you to do me a favor. See that veteran over there? His name's probably displayed somewhere, maybe on a cap, a shirt, something. I want to know his name, and I want you to treat him like he's the most important customer you've ever had. Can you do that?" "Are you?" Sarah started. "I'm just someone who believes in showing respect where it's due," Garth interrupted gently. "Now, About that favor? Sarah nodded, suddenly understanding that this was about more than celebrity whims. She walked to Bobby's table with noticeably different body language, straighter posture, genuine attention. "Excuse me, sir," she said, and this time she made eye contact. "The gentleman over there wanted to make sure you have everything you need. Can I get you something to eat? Maybe the breakfast special." Bobby looked up, surprise evident on his weathered face. "That's very kind, but I couldn't." "It's already taken care of," Sarah said, her tone warmer than it had been all morning. "And sir, I noticed your cap." Bobby was indeed wearing a faded Vietnam veteran's cap. "Thank you for your service." Garth watched as Bobby's eyes filled with tears he quickly tried to hide. When was the last time someone had said those words to him, and meant them? "Robert Mitchell," Bobby said quietly, offering his hand to Sarah. "Bobby, to my friends. Sarah Chen, and Mr. Mitchell. What would you like for breakfast? Really, anything at all." As Bobby contemplated the menu with new possibilities, Frank Morrison's conversation grew louder and more pointed. "Look, I pay my taxes. I support the military we have now, but we can't keep paying for every sad story from 50 years ago." Jake Morrison nodded agreement. "Exactly, Dad. It's like they think they're special or something." Garth had heard enough. He stood up, his 6-foot frame commanding attention even without the cowboy hat that usually accompanied his public appearances. The diner gradually quieted as he walked toward the Morrison table, his boot heels clicking against the worn linoleum. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, his Oklahoma drawl more pronounced when he was emotional. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about veterans." Frank looked up, irritation evident. "Yeah? What about it?" "Well, I was just thinking about what you said. About Vietnam being 50 years ago. About moving on." Garth pulled out the chair beside Frank without asking permission and sat down. "Mind if I share a perspective?" Something in Garth's demeanor made Frank hesitate. This wasn't a confrontation, exactly, but there was an intensity to the stranger that suggested he wasn't someone to dismiss casually. "I guess," Frank said. 50 years ago," Garth began, his voice carrying across the now quiet diner, "men who were barely old enough to vote were drafted to fight in a war that most Americans didn't understand, in a place they'd never heard of, for reasons that changed depending on who was doing the explaining. They left behind girlfriends, wives, jobs, college plans, everything that defined their future." The diner had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds seemed muted. Now, some of those boys came home in boxes, and we honor them on Memorial Day with flags and speeches. But the ones who came home walking? Many of them came back to a country that called them baby killers, that spit on them in airports, that told them their war wasn't worth fighting, and their sacrifice didn't matter. Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look, man, we're not saying—" Garth held up a gentle but firm hand. "Let me finish, son. Those young men, and they were so young, 18, 19, 20 years old, they carried wounds you couldn't see. They watched friends die. They saw things that no human being should have to see. They made life and death decisions before they were old enough to legally buy a beer." Bobby Mitchell, listening from his corner booth, felt tears streaming down his face. Someone was finally saying what he'd felt for decades, but never had the words to express. "And when they came home," Garth continued, "they didn't get parades. They got told to get over it, move on, stop living in the past. They got jobs if they were lucky, struggled with nightmares, with survivor's guilt, with trying to fit into a society that had moved on without them." Frank Morrison's face had grown red. "That's all well and good, but we can't—" "Frank Morrison, right?" Garth interrupted, and Frank nodded, surprised. You own Morrison's Auto Shop on Hillside Drive. I've seen your ads. Quality service since 1987. That's almost 40 years you've been building your business, building your reputation, creating something you're proud of. Yeah, so? So imagine if someone told you that because you started your business 40 years ago, it doesn't matter anymore. That all the late nights, all the customers you helped, all the employees you hired, all the contribution you made to this community, none of it counts because it was in the past. The comparison hit home, and Garth could see Frank beginning to understand. That veteran over there, Garth nodded toward Bobby, he didn't just serve 50 years ago and then sit around waiting for handouts. He came home and worked construction for 3 decades. He paid taxes, raised a family, contributed to his community. But he also carried the weight of what he'd seen and done in service to his country. And when his body finally broke down from both age and the lasting effects of his service, he didn't get a comfortable retirement. He got by on Social Security and a small VA disability payment. Sarah Chen, who had been listening intently while serving Bobby his breakfast special, found herself seeing her elderly customer completely differently. Here was someone who had answered his country's call when called upon, who had sacrificed his youth, his peace of mind, and ultimately his health, and who was now struggling just to afford breakfast in a diner. The point, Garth said, standing up from the Morrison table, isn't that we should pity veterans or treat them like charity cases. The point is that we should recognize that service to your country isn't something that expires after a certain number of years. It's not like a warranty that runs out. When someone puts their life on the line for the abstract idea that we call freedom, that debt doesn't diminish over time. The entire diner was watching now, and Garth felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't a concert performance or a planned speech. This was a real conversation with real consequences for how people would treat each other going forward. And Frank, he added, turning back to the auto shop owner, I bet if someone brought their car to your shop and you fixed it right, you'd expect them to remember that quality service, even years later. Maybe even recommend you to friends, right? Frank nodded slowly. Well, that man over there fixed something a lot more important than a car engine. He helped fix a threat to our entire way of life. Seems like that's worth remembering, don't you think? With that, Garth walked back to his table, leaving Frank and Jake Morrison to contemplate his words. As he passed Bobby's table, the veteran looked up with eyes full of gratitude and recognition. Thank you, Bobby said simply. No, sir, Garth replied, extending his hand. Thank you. Garth Brooks. Bobby's eyes widened as he shook Garth's hand. I thought you looked familiar. Bobby Mitchell, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam, 1970-71. Bobby Mitchell, it's an honor to meet you. And in that moment, the entire dynamic of Mel's Diner shifted. Sarah Chen found herself bringing Bobby a fresh cup of coffee without being asked. Other customers began glancing toward the veteran's table with curiosity rather than indifference. Frank Morrison sat quietly, processing what he'd heard. But the morning's revelations were far from over. Garth Brooks had started something that was about to grow beyond anything he could have imagined. Word spread through Nashville faster than Garth Brooks could have imagined. By evening, a cell phone video of his impromptu speech at Mel's Diner had been shared thousands of times on social media, accompanied by comments ranging from heartfelt support to political debates about veteran care. But the real impact was happening in smaller, more personal ways. Sarah Chen drove home to her apartment that afternoon with Bobby Mitchell's words echoing in her mind. After Garth's speech, she'd sat with the veteran during her break, really listening for the first time as he told her about Martha, about their 43-year marriage, about how she'd waited for him to come back from Vietnam and then spent 4 decades helping him heal from what he'd experienced there. "She never made me feel broken," Bobby had said, stirring sugar into his third cup of coffee. "Even when I'd wake up screaming from nightmares, even when I couldn't go to crowded places for years, even when I'd get angry over nothing, she never made me feel like I was damaged goods." Sarah thought about her own grandfather, who'd fled Vietnam during the war as a refugee, eventually making his way to America with nothing but hope and determination. She'd never considered that an American soldier might have experienced his own kind of trauma from that same conflict. That evening, Sarah called her mother, Linda Chen, who worked as a nurse at Nashville General Hospital. "Mom, do we have any Vietnam veterans in the hospital right now?" Linda paused, surprised by the unexpected question. "Several, actually. Why do you ask?" "I met one today at work. He seemed so lonely, and I realized I never really thought about what they might have gone through. I was wondering if maybe some of them don't get many visitors." "Oh, sweetheart, that's exactly right. We have one patient, William Hayes, who's been here for 2 weeks with pneumonia. He doesn't have any family, and I don't think he's had a single visitor. He was asking me yesterday about the war, wanting to tell someone about his service. I think he just needs someone to listen." Sarah made a decision that surprised her. "Would it be okay if I visited him tomorrow? I have the day off." Meanwhile, across town, Frank Morrison was having a difficult conversation with his son Jake. They were in Frank's garage, where he did his best thinking while tinkering with engines. "Dad, that guy at the diner, he kind of made us look like jerks," Jake said, wiping grease from his hands. Frank nodded, his usual defensiveness replaced by something closer to reflection. "Yeah, he did. Thing is, Jake, I think maybe we were being jerks." "What do you mean?" Frank set down his wrench and leaned against his workbench. "Your grandfather, my dad, he served in Korea. Did I ever tell you about the nightmares he used to have?" Jake shook his head. "When I was about your age, maybe a little younger, I'd hear him sometimes at night. Your grandmother would get up and sit with him, make him coffee, talk him through whatever he was reliving. I asked her about it once, and she said the war never really left him. Said he saw friends die over there, had to do things that haunted him. Grandpa Joe never talked about the war." "Exactly. And I never thought about why until today. That man at the diner, that Brooks fellow, he was right about one thing. We expect these guys to just get over it and move on. But we've never tried to understand what they need to get over." Frank pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. "Remember Jimmy Patterson? Used to work for me? The guy with the army tattoo? Afghanistan, 2 tours. He was a good worker, reliable, but sometimes he'd get this look, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't see. I thought he was just daydreaming, but now..." Frank found Jimmy's number. "I'm going to give him a call, see how he's doing." The ripple effect was reaching beyond the diner's regular customers. Emma Rodriguez, a local news reporter for WSMV-TV, had received the video from a friend who thought it might make a good human interest story. But as Emma watched Garth Brooks speak with such passion about veteran recognition, she realized this was bigger than just a celebrity moment. Emma had been looking for a way to honor her brother Miguel, a Marine who'd been killed in Iraq 5 years earlier. Miguel's death had devastated their family, but it was the way he'd been forgotten by everyone except his immediate family that haunted Emma most. His friends had moved on, his girlfriend had married someone else, and even the local VFW Post had never reached out to acknowledge his service. She decided to use her platform to do more than just report the diner story. She would create a series called Forgotten Heroes, focusing on local veterans whose stories deserve to be told. Her first call was to Bobby Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Emma Rodriguez from Channel 4 News. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share your story with our viewers. Not just about this morning at the diner, but about your service, your life, what it means to be a veteran in Nashville today. Bobby, still somewhat overwhelmed by the day's events, hesitated. "I'm not sure anyone would be interested in what I have to say. Sir, after what happened today, I think you'd be surprised how many people are interested, and more importantly, how many people need to hear your story." That same evening, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in PTSD treatment at the Nashville VA Medical Center, was scrolling through Facebook when she saw the video. She'd been working with veterans for 15 years, and she recognized the expression on Bobby Mitchell's face when Garth Brooks spoke about service and sacrifice. It was the look of someone who'd been carrying a burden alone for too long, finally hearing someone else acknowledge its weight. Dr. Martinez had been trying for months to get funding for a community outreach program that would connect isolated veterans with volunteers and support services. The hospital's administration kept saying there wasn't enough community interest to justify the expense. She forwarded the video to her supervisor, Dr. James Thompson, with a simple message. "Still think there's no community interest in supporting our veterans?" Within an hour, Dr. Thompson called her back. "Rebecca, I've been getting calls all evening from people who saw this video. Volunteers, donors, even other medical professionals offering to help. Maybe it's time to revisit that outreach program." Back at Mel's Diner, owner Melvin "Mel" Washington was closing up for the night when he noticed something he'd never seen before. Someone had left flowers on the table where Bobby Mitchell usually sat. There was a small card that read, "Thank you for your service. A grateful American." Mel, a Korean War veteran himself, felt a tightness in his throat. He'd opened the diner 23 years ago as a simple neighborhood breakfast spot, never imagining it would become the setting for something like today's events. He thought about Bobby, who'd been coming in for years, always polite, never complaining, quietly dignified in his solitude. Mel made a decision. Tomorrow, he would do something he should have done long ago. At his modest apartment across town, Bobby Mitchell sat in his recliner, still processing the surreal events of the morning. The phone had been ringing all evening. Reporters, neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years, even some fellow veterans who'd seen the video and wanted to reconnect. But the call that meant the most had come from his estranged nephew, David Mitchell, who lived in Atlanta. David's father, Bobby's younger brother, had died in a car accident 10 years earlier, and the family had drifted apart in grief. David had been only 12 when Bobby returned from Vietnam, and he'd grown up hearing whispered conversations about his uncle's problems with nightmares and angry outbursts. "Uncle Bobby," David had said on the phone, "I saw that video, and I realized I never understood what you went through. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to stand up and say what should have been said years ago." Now, as Bobby prepared for bed, he looked at the photograph on his nightstand. Martha, in her wedding dress, radiant with joy and hope. For the first time since her death, he didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness that usually accompanied his evening rituals. "Martha," he said quietly to the photograph, "I think something's changing. I don't know what it means yet. But today, I felt seen again." Across Nashville, in a dozen different homes and offices, people were making plans, reaching out to veterans they'd ignored, reconsidering assumptions they'd held for years. Garth Brooks had simply stood up for basic human decency, but his words had unlocked something in people's hearts, a recognition that gratitude shouldn't have an expiration date, and that the price of freedom includes caring for those who paid it. The morning's encounter at Mel's Diner had planted seeds of change that were already beginning to grow. But the most significant changes were yet to come. As the community discovered that honoring veterans wasn't just about giving back to them, It was about reclaiming something essential about themselves. 3 weeks after the incident at Mel's Diner, Nashville had become a different kind of city for its veterans. Emma Rodriguez's Forgotten Heroes series had sparked a community-wide conversation about veteran care and recognition, while Dr. Rebecca Martinez's outreach program had attracted more volunteers than she could process. But the most meaningful changes were happening at the individual level, in the quiet moments between people who had found new ways to connect. Sarah Chen had become a regular visitor to Nashville General Hospital, spending her days off with William Hayes and other veterans who'd been forgotten by time and circumstance. What started as guilt-driven community service had evolved into genuine relationships that enriched her own life in unexpected ways. "Sarah, you remind me of my daughter," William told her during one of their conversations. He was 81, a Marine who'd served in both Korea and Vietnam, and his daughter lived in California with grandchildren he barely knew. "She used to listen to my stories when she was young, before life got so complicated." "What happened?" Sarah asked, arranging fresh flowers she'd brought from her mother's garden. William's eyes grew distant. "The war changed me, made me angry, impatient. When I came back from Vietnam, I drank too much, worked too much, tried to forget too much. By the time I got my head straight, she was grown and gone. She sends Christmas cards, but we lost the connection somewhere along the way." Sarah thought about her own relationship with her grandfather, how she'd taken his presence for granted until he'd passed away 2 years earlier. "Have you tried calling her?" "What would I say? Sorry, I was a mess for 20 years. But I'm better now? Maybe you could start with, 'I love you, and I miss you,'" Sarah suggested gently. That afternoon, with Sarah's encouragement, William placed a call to his daughter Jennifer in San Diego. It was awkward at first, tentative, but when he began talking about the flowers Sarah had brought and how much her visits meant to him, Jennifer heard something in her father's voice she hadn't heard in decades. "Peace." "Dad," she said, crying on the phone, "I've been wanting to call you for years, but I didn't know if you wanted to hear from me." "Sweetheart, I've wanted to hear from you every day for 20 years. I just didn't think I deserved to." 3 days later, Jennifer flew to Nashville with her 2 teenage children to visit their grandfather. It was Sarah who opened the door to William's hospital room to find 3 generations of the Hayes family reunited, sharing stories and beginning to heal wounds that had festered for too long. Meanwhile, Frank Morrison had made his own journey of understanding. His call to former employee Jimmy Patterson had led to a 2-hour conversation about Afghanistan, PTSD, and the challenges of readjusting to civilian life after combat. Jimmy had been struggling with nightmares and anxiety since his discharge, working a series of temporary jobs because he couldn't concentrate for long periods. "Jimmy," Frank had said, "I owe you an apology. I never understood what you were dealing with, and I should have been more patient, more supportive. Mr. Morrison, you gave me work when a lot of places wouldn't hire veterans. That meant more than you know." Frank made a decision that surprised even him. "Jimmy, how would you feel about coming back? Permanent position, good benefits, and we'll work around whatever schedule you need for any counseling or treatment." But Frank didn't stop there. He reached out to other local business owners, many of whom had employed veterans without really understanding their unique needs and challenges. Together, they formed the Nashville Veteran Business Alliance, dedicated to creating veteran-friendly workplaces and supporting veteran-owned businesses. The Alliance's first initiative was partnering with Dr. Martinez's outreach program to provide job placement services and mental health support for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Within a month, they had placed 15 veterans in sustainable employment and connected dozens more with support services they'd never known existed. Bobby Mitchell found himself at the center of these expanding circles of change. Emma Rodriguez's feature story about his life had touched thousands of viewers, leading to an unexpected reunion with several members of his old Army unit. Men he hadn't spoken to in 40 years began reaching out, sharing their own struggles with readjustment, loss, and the long journey toward healing. One of those calls came from Tom Bradley, who'd served alongside Bobby in the 1st Cavalry Division and had struggled with alcoholism for decades after the war. Tom had been sober for 12 years and was working as a counselor at a veteran treatment center in Memphis. "Bobby, I saw that news story about you, and I had to call," Tom said. "I've been thinking about you for years, wondering if you made it through okay." "Tom, my God, I thought about you too. Are you doing all right?" "I am now. It took me 20 years to get sober and another 10 to figure out how to help other guys going through what we went through. But Bobby, hearing you talk about Martha, about how she stood by you, it reminded me why I kept fighting to get better." The conversation between the old soldiers lasted 3 hours, filled with memories both painful and precious, and ended with plans for Tom to visit Nashville the following month. More importantly, it gave Bobby a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Martha's death. Tom connected him with other veterans who were struggling with isolation and depression, and Bobby found himself becoming an informal counselor, using his own experience with loss and loneliness to help others navigate their darkest moments. "You know what I learned from Martha?" Bobby told a young Iraq veteran named Marcus Williams during one of their weekly coffee meetings at Mel's Diner. "Healing isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it doesn't hurt anymore. It's about learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you." Marcus, who'd been struggling with survivor's guilt after losing his best friend to an IED blast, found comfort in Bobby's words. At 28, he'd felt ancient and broken, unable to relate to his civilian peers who worried about career advancement and weekend plans while he carried images of war that never faded. "How do you do it?" Marcus asked. "How do you wake up every morning and choose to keep going?" Bobby smiled, thinking of Martha's gentle wisdom. "You find something bigger than your pain to live for. For me, it was Martha for 43 years. Now, it's helping guys like you realize you're not broken, just wounded, and wounds can heal if you tend them properly." Mel Washington had implemented his own changes at the diner. He'd created what he quietly called the Veterans Corner, a section of tables where veterans ate for free on Sundays, and where anyone could sit and share stories or simply find companionship. He'd also hired 2 veteran employees, Patricia "Pat" Sullivan, a Navy veteran who'd served in the Gulf War and brought organizational skills that transformed the diner's efficiency, and Carlos Mendoza, an Army veteran from Iraq who turned out to have exceptional culinary talent. The corner became a gathering place for veterans from all eras: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, men and women who found in each other's company the understanding that civilian life rarely provided. Sarah Chen often spent her breaks there, listening to stories that textbooks had never captured, learning about courage and sacrifice in ways that changed her perspective on everything. But perhaps the most significant transformation was happening in the relationship between Garth Brooks and Bobby Mitchell. What had begun as a moment of spontaneous decency had evolved into a genuine friendship between 2 men from different worlds who discovered they shared similar values and struggles. Garth had invited Bobby to his farm outside Nashville, where they spent long afternoons talking about music, loss, service, and the challenge of staying true to yourself in a world that often demanded conformity. Bobby learned that Garth's success hadn't insulated him from pain. The country star had struggled through a difficult divorce, battled with depression, and constantly wrestled with the pressure of public expectations. "You know what I admire about you, Bobby?" Garth said one evening as they sat on his porch. watching the sun set over the Tennessee hills. You've never compromised who you are. Despite everything you've been through, you've maintained your dignity, your integrity, your capacity for kindness. That's real strength. Bobby shook his head. I don't feel strong most days. I feel tired, forgotten, sometimes bitter about how things turned out. But you get up anyway. You treat people with respect anyway. You keep Martha's memory alive through how you live, not just how you grieve. That's the kind of strength that matters. Their friendship had practical benefits as well. Garth quietly helped Bobby with medical bills and housing costs, but more importantly, he provided Bobby with opportunities to share his story in meaningful ways. When Garth performed at the Grand Ole Opry, he brought Bobby as his guest, introducing him to the audience as a true American hero who reminded me what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. The response was overwhelming. Standing ovations, tears, and afterward, dozens of people approached Bobby to thank him for his service and share their own connections to military families. For the first time in years, Bobby felt like his sacrifice had been acknowledged, not just by individuals, but by his community. Dr. Martinez's outreach program had grown beyond her wildest expectations. The initial video had inspired donations from across the country, allowing her to expand services and hire additional staff. But more importantly, it had attracted volunteers like Sarah Chen, Frank Morrison, and dozens of others who were discovering that supporting veterans was as rewarding for them as it was beneficial for those they served. What we're seeing, Dr. Martinez told Emma Rodriguez during a follow-up interview, is something that should have happened decades ago. We're bridging the gap between veteran and civilian communities, creating relationships based on mutual respect and understanding rather than pity or obligation. The program now included weekly support groups, job placement services, family counseling, recreational activities, and what Dr. Martinez considered most important, regular social gatherings where veterans and civilians could interact as equals, sharing experiences and building friendships. One of the most successful initiatives was the Adopt a Veteran program, where civilian families or individuals committed to regular contact with isolated veterans. Sarah Chen had formally adopted William Hayes, ensuring he'd never lack for visitors or emotional support. Frank Morrison had connected with 3 different veterans, helping them find employment and providing ongoing mentorship. But the program worked both ways. Civilians discovered that veterans had wisdom and perspective that enriched their own lives. Parents found that veterans made excellent role models for their children, teaching lessons about responsibility, sacrifice, and perseverance that couldn't be learned from textbooks. Emma Rodriguez's reporting had evolved beyond simple news stories into a documentary project that was attracting national attention. She'd secured funding from several major networks to create a full-length film about how communities could support their veterans, using Nashville's transformation as a model for other cities. What happened here, Emma explained to a producer from CNN, wasn't just about one celebrity standing up for one veteran. It was about people rediscovering their capacity for compassion and realizing that taking care of veterans isn't charity. It's citizenship. The documentary would feature interviews with Bobby, Garth, Sarah, Frank, Dr. Martinez, and dozens of other people whose lives had been changed by the events that started at Mel's Diner. But more importantly, it would serve as a blueprint for other communities struggling with veteran isolation and support. As autumn arrived in Nashville, the changes that had begun with a simple gesture of kindness had grown into a movement that was transforming not just how the city treated its veterans, but how neighbors related to each other, how businesses thought about their responsibilities to their communities. and how individuals understood their capacity to make a difference in other people's lives. Bobby Mitchell, who 6 months earlier had sat alone in a corner booth, feeling invisible and forgotten, now found his calendar filled with coffee meetings, support group sessions, speaking engagements, and social gatherings. But more than the activity, what had changed was his sense of purpose. He was no longer just surviving each day. He was contributing to something meaningful, helping other veterans find their way through the darkness he knew so well. "Martha," he said to her photograph one evening, "I think you'd be proud of what's happening here. All these people coming together, caring for each other. It's what you always believed was possible. I just wish you could see it." But in the morning, when he woke to phone calls from veterans seeking advice, text messages from Sarah checking on his health, and an email from Tom Bradley sharing news about another successful intervention at the Memphis Treatment Center, Bobby felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The certainty that Martha could see it, and that she was indeed proud of what her love had helped him become. The ripple effect that had started with Garth Brooks standing up for basic human decency had become a wave of change that was still growing, still reaching new people, still proving that individual acts of courage and compassion could transform entire communities. But the story wasn't over. The greatest challenges and the most profound changes were yet to come. As Nashville's veteran community faced its ultimate test, and the bonds that had been forged in coffee shops and hospital rooms would be tested in ways no one could have anticipated. 6 months after that transformative morning at Mel's Diner, Nashville's veteran community faced its greatest challenge yet. Marcus Williams, the young Iraq veteran who'd been meeting regularly with Bobby Mitchell, had disappeared without warning. His apartment was empty, his phone disconnected, and his few belongings were gone. The only clue was a note left on his kitchen table. "I can't carry this anymore. Tell Bobby I'm sorry." The news reached Bobby through Dr. Martinez, who called him at 6 in the morning with the kind of urgency that made his heart race. "Bobby, we need your help. Marcus is missing, and based on the note he left, we're very concerned about his safety." Bobby was dressed and out the door within 10 minutes, his mind racing with memories of their last conversation. Marcus had seemed better, more hopeful, talking about a job interview Frank Morrison had arranged for him. But Bobby recognized the signs he'd missed: the forced optimism, the sudden calmness after weeks of agitation, the way Marcus had insisted on paying for coffee when he rarely had money to spare. He was saying goodbye, Bobby told Dr. Martinez when he arrived at the VA center. "I should have seen it." "Bobby, you're not responsible for Marcus's choices," Dr. Martinez said gently. "But you might be the key to finding him before he makes a permanent one." Within hours, the network that had grown from Garth Brooks's simple act of kindness had mobilized into a search operation that demonstrated just how deeply the community connections had taken root. Sarah Chen took time off work to coordinate communication between search teams. Frank Morrison closed his auto shop and enlisted his employees and customers in the search. Emma Rodriguez used her media platform to spread the word without sensationalizing Marcus's crisis. Garth Brooks, who was in the middle of a recording session, immediately left the studio when he heard the news. "Some things are more important than making music," he told his surprised band members. The search strategy was organized around understanding Marcus, rather than simply looking for him. Bobby, Tom Bradley, who had driven from Memphis as soon as he heard, and several other veterans sat down to think like someone in Marcus's emotional state. "Where would you go if you wanted to disappear?" Bobby asked the group assembled at Mel's Diner, which had become the unofficial command center for the search. "Somewhere with meaning," suggested Carlos Mendoza, the Iraq veteran who now worked in Mel's kitchen. "Not just remote, but connected to what's hurting him." Tom Bradley nodded. "When I was at my lowest point, before I got sober, I went to the cemetery where my buddy from Vietnam was buried. I wanted to be close to the guilt, to make it hurt more before I made it stop. The insight led them to investigate places connected to Marcus's military service and his lost friend. Emma Rodriguez used her journalism skills to research Marcus's unit, his deployments, and any local connections to his service. What she found sent chills through the search team. Marcus's best friend, Staff Sergeant David Chen, no relation to Sarah, who'd been killed by the IED blast that had haunted Marcus's dreams, was buried in Nashville National Cemetery. According to military records, Marcus had never visited the grave, a detail that suddenly seemed critically important. Bobby, Garth, and Tom Bradley drove to the cemetery together, their conversation shifting between hopeful prayers and worst-case scenarios. The autumn sun was setting as they arrived, casting long shadows across the precisely aligned white headstones. They found Marcus sitting cross-legged in front of David Chen's grave, an empty bottle of pills beside him on the grass. He was conscious but groggy, talking quietly to the headstone as if his friend could hear every word. "I'm sorry, Dave. I'm sorry I came home and you didn't. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I've been wasting the life you died for." Bobby approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal, with caution, respect, and infinite patience. "Marcus," he said softly, sitting down beside the young veteran, "David can hear you, but so can I. And I think he'd want you to know something." Marcus looked up, his eyes unfocused, but aware enough to recognize Bobby's voice. "Bobby? How did you find me?" "We all found you, son. Sarah, Frank, Dr. Martinez, even Garth here. We all came looking because we care about you, just like David cared about you." Garth and Tom hung back slightly, understanding that this conversation belonged to Bobby and Marcus, but ready to help if needed. "I took the pills," Marcus whispered. "Not all of them, but enough. I wanted to see if I could go through with it, if I really wanted to die, or if I just wanted the pain to stop." Bobby nodded, understanding completely. "And what did you decide?" "I don't want to die," Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. "I just don't know how to live with this guilt, this feeling that I don't deserve to be here when he's not." "Marcus, look at me," Bobby said firmly. "David didn't die so you could feel guilty for the rest of your life. He died serving his country, protecting his friends, doing his duty. If you waste the life he helped save, you're not honoring his sacrifice. You're making it meaningless." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but they also cut through the fog of self-pity and depression that had been consuming him for months. "What am I supposed to do?" Marcus asked. "You're supposed to live," Bobby said simply. "Not just survive, not just get by, but really live. You're supposed to build something good with the days David can't have. You're supposed to love people, help people, contribute something positive to the world. That's how you honor a fallen friend." Garth stepped forward then, his voice gentle but clear. "Marcus, I've never served in combat, so I can't pretend to understand what you're going through. But I do know something about carrying guilt and pain. The question isn't whether you deserve to be here. You are here, and that's a fact. The question is what you're going to do with the gift of being here." Tom Bradley joined the circle around Marcus. "Son, I tried to drink myself to death for 20 years because I felt guilty about coming home from Vietnam when better men didn't. You know what I learned? Guilt is just love with nowhere to go. Instead of letting it poison you, you can let it motivate you to live in a way that would make your friend proud." By now, word had spread through the search teams that Marcus had been found safe. Sarah Chen arrived with Dr. Martinez, followed by Frank Morrison, Mel Washington, and dozens of other people who had become invested in Marcus's well-being over the past months. As the crowd gathered around Marcus at David Chen's grave, something extraordinary happened. What had started as a suicide intervention became an impromptu memorial service, not just for David Chen, but for all the fallen soldiers whose deaths had haunted the survivors' lives. Veterans began sharing stories about friends they'd lost, guilt they'd carried, and moments when they'd felt like giving up. Civilians talked about family members who'd served and died, about the impact of loss on entire families and communities. Sarah Chen read David Chen's name aloud, followed by his rank, his age at death, and his hometown. Then, one by one, other names were spoken. Friends, brothers, sisters, sons, daughters who had given their lives in service to their country. "We're not here because we feel sorry for ourselves," Bobby said to the gathering crowd. "We're here because we remember them, and because we choose to live in a way that honors their sacrifice." Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him. Some he knew well, others he'd never seen before, all united in their commitment to his survival and recovery. In that moment, he began to understand something that had eluded him for months. He wasn't alone in his guilt, his pain, or his struggle to find meaning after loss. Dr. Martinez worked with the EMTs to ensure Marcus received proper medical attention for the pills he'd taken. But it was clear that the real healing was happening in the circle of people who had refused to let him face his darkest moment alone. Over the following weeks, Marcus's recovery became a community effort. Frank Morrison gave him a job at the auto shop, not out of charity, but because he genuinely needed help, and Marcus had mechanical skills from his Army service. Sarah Chen included him in her regular hospital visits, showing him how helping others could provide purpose and perspective. Tom Bradley worked with him on processing survivors' guilt through the lens of his own recovery journey. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus began visiting David Chen's grave regularly. Not to wallow in guilt, but to report on his progress, to share his victories and struggles with his fallen friend. Bobby often joined him for these visits, and their conversations evolved from grief counseling to friendship, from survival strategies to life planning. "You know what I think David would say if he could see you now?" Bobby asked during one of their cemetery visits as they watched Marcus place fresh flowers on the grave. "What?" "I think he'd say, 'Finally, you're getting it. Finally, you're living like the man I knew you could be.'" Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Bobby had seen from him. "I think you're right. And Bobby, I think Martha would say the same thing about you." The crisis had revealed something profound about the community that had grown from Garth Brooks' simple act of standing up for Bobby Mitchell at Mel's Diner. They had become more than a support network for veterans. They had become a family, bound together by shared values of service, sacrifice, and mutual care. Emma Rodriguez documented Marcus's story as part of her larger documentary about Nashville's transformation, but she was careful to focus on the community response rather than sensationalizing his crisis. The film, titled "Standing Up: How One Moment Changed a City," premiered at the Nashville Film Festival to a standing ovation and was picked up for national distribution. But for those who had lived through the events, the real victory wasn't media attention or national recognition. It was the knowledge that they had created something sustainable, something that would continue to grow and support veterans for years to come. Dr. Martinez's outreach program had secured permanent funding and was being replicated in cities across the country. Frank Morrison's Veteran Business Alliance had become a model for veteran employment support. Sarah Chen had changed her major to social work, inspired by her experiences with veterans to pursue a career in community service. And at the center of it all, Bobby Mitchell continued to serve as an informal counselor and mentor to veterans struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. His apartment had become a gathering place for men and women seeking guidance, understanding, or simply companionship from someone who'd walked a similar path. "You know," Garth Brooks said to Bobby during one of their regular visits, "when I stood up in that diner, I thought I was just correcting some ignorant comments about veterans. I had no idea we were starting something this big." Bobby smiled, thinking about all the lives that had been changed, all the connections that had been made, all the healing that had happened because one person chose to speak up for what was right. "Martha always said that kindness was like throwing a stone in a pond," he replied. "You never know how far the ripples will reach." As winter settled over Nashville, the ripples were still spreading. Veterans who had been isolated for decades were finding community and purpose. Civilians were discovering the joy and meaning that came from serving others. Businesses were learning that supporting veterans wasn't just good citizenship, it was good business. And in a small diner where it all began, Mel Washington had framed the original newspaper article about Garth Brooks's speech and hung it near the veterans' corner, where it served as a daily reminder that individual acts of courage and compassion could indeed change the world. The story that had started with one elderly veteran feeling invisible in a crowded diner had become a testament to the power of recognition, respect, and community. It proved that heroes weren't just those who served in uniform, but anyone who chose to stand up for what was right, to see the dignity in others, and to act on the belief that everyone deserves to be valued for their contributions to the common good. In the end, Bobby Mitchell got more than he'd ever dared hope for when he walked into Mel's diner that morning. He found a community that would never let him be invisible again, and a purpose that would sustain him for whatever years remained. And in finding those things, he'd helped create them for countless others who had been waiting, sometimes for decades, for someone to simply see them and say, "Thank you. You matter. You're not forgotten." The gesture that changed everything had become the foundation for something even greater. A community united by the understanding that taking care of each other isn't just a nice thing to do. It's the very essence of what makes us human.